Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on this Thursday. We are really pleased to have you here for our fourth in this part of our webinar series on funding and equity. This title today is What to Expect When Seeking Funding from VCs. I'm Kirsten Lloyd. I'm a partner here at OUP. I head up our university relationships, and I'm really pleased to be joined today by two of my colleagues. And we'll start out with them introducing themselves. Mitra, would you start?
Hi, thanks, Kirsten. Miri here. I'm a principal in the life sciences investment team at OUP. Background is PhD in neuroscience from Yale. I shifted over into biopharma consulting at LEK for a few years and then moved into VC, initially at a firm in Connecticut before joining OUP in late 2021.
Great. Thank you so much, Mitra. Nee.
Hi, my name's Nee. My background is in electrical engineering and a PhD in physics from the University of Leeds in the UK. I then did a postdoc at Cambridge studying quantum computing devices. And then I shifted into the commercial world, starting in the semiconductor world. Worked for two companies there. After a while, did an MBA between Europe and the US, and then transitioned into investing, first in a role in a late stage firm doing emerging market investing, and more recently with OUP as a senior associate in the tech team.
Great, thank you, Nee and Mitra. As you can see, two experts in the field that we'll be talking about today of what to expect when seeking funding from venture capital groups. This, as I mentioned, is a part of our webinar series on funding and equity. We already had the first three webinars in this series, and you can find recordings of those. I'll put links in the chat later for those of you who would like to view those previous ones. We've got the fourth one today, and then we'll have our cap tables and exits and payouts webinar in June of this year, and then setting up your boards in August or so. Just a little bit before we get into the meat of today, the slides and recording of this webinar will be available on OUP's partner portal, and also recording will be publicly available on our YouTube channel. The partner portal that I mentioned is an online portal for the tech transfer officers and researchers at our partner universities that's full of relevant technology transfer and startup content. For those of you who are with our partner universities, you can register for this if you haven't already. And within that, you will then find a downloadable version of the presentation and a video link for this webinar. We do encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar today. Please do so using the Q&A tool on the toolbar that you can see here. And I'll be monitoring those questions and asking them of our panelists as we go along here. For those of us who do not know OUP, we are a venture capital fund that partners with academic institutions to invest in their startups, typically by exercising the participation rights available through their licenses. As a part of this partnership, the institutions share in our profits and receive programmatic support on tech transfer and academic startups, such as this webinar today. OUP is now investing out of its fourth fund. We've raised approximately $800 million across all three funds, and we've made over 130 investments in the areas of deep sciences. And many of those companies have had successful exits, either through IPOs or merger and acquisition. And the next slide actually shows some examples of the companies that we've invested in, as well as the areas that we invested. So it's all deep science that we're interested in investing in. However, I'm going to move on to the focus of today, which is this following agenda, VC 101, followed by the diligence process that VCs go through, particularly obviously focused on our firm and what it is that we do, looking at the team, evaluating the data, the market opportunity, the intellectual property, regulatory considerations, especially in the areas of life sciences, obviously, competitive landscape, valuation and exit analysis, and then the investment memos that the VCs are producing and amending along the way as they go through their diligence process. So with that, I will pass the baton off to Nee.
Right. Thank you, Kirsten. Right. So I thought we'll sort of quickly go through the basic structure of a venture capital fund, because understanding the nature of how venture capital firms are set up helps us to understand the incentives and motives that guide the decision-making of VCs. So when you boil it down to its simplest components, a VC firm is essentially a contractual agreement between two entities. You've got the general partners or GPs of the firm, and then you've also got on the other side the limited partners or the LPs. The general partners are the folks we colloquially call venture capitalists or VCs. And I will use this term interchangeably, VCs, GPs, throughout this talk. So the GPs or the venture capitalists are responsible for allocating capital efficiently to produce the best possible returns for the fund. But predominantly, this capital doesn't originate from the GPs, or at least the majority of it doesn't. GPs raise this money from LPs, and it's important to note that even though GPs work in the fund, LPs are actually not involved in the day-to-day running of the fund, nor are they involved in the investing process. That's just done by the GPs. They simply provide the capital that's needed to enable investing. LPs are usually aggregation centers of capital, so you can think of them as insurance companies, pension funds, and endowment funds, some family offices, and sometimes high net worth individuals. Next slide, please. So if you think about it, VCs essentially work for LPs, and this is borne out in the compensation structure between the two. VCs generally earn a management fee between 2 to 2.5% of the total capital they raise from LPs. But these fees go towards administering the fund and managing the fund, and they sort of pay for, base salaries of employees, renting of office spaces, travel expenses, etc. And since the provider of capital are the LPs, they essentially earn the overwhelming share of the profits from the venture. So first of all, LPs get all their money back, including the management fees I just mentioned. And if there's anything left, i.e. the profits, it's split in a sort of 20-80 share, with 80% of it going to LPs and 20% of it going to the GPs or the VCs, as it were. And this profit share to the VCs is known as the carried interest. Next slide, please. So now that we know a little bit about the sort of key and central relationship between the LP and the GP, let's talk about the fund itself and the life cycle of a fund. So a typical VC fund lasts for about 10 years, or at least that's the idea, or perhaps that's the goal, right? An extension is possible, but generally one prefers to avoid that. The reason for this expiration date, as it were, is that these funds have to return capital back to their LPs in a timely manner, so they can't hold on to the capital indefinitely. So you can think of it as sort of there being pressure on the VCs to deliver returns in a timely manner, and this sort of pressure essentially informs how VCs make decisions on what to invest in and when. In year 1 through to 4, this period is called the investment period. VCs invest the bulk of the money that they get from LPs. And between year 4 and 10, they're sort of in the act of recovering those funds back into the fund. A simple way to sort of think of the motivation of a VC here is that, if a VC makes an investment in year 1, they essentially have up to year 10, so about 9 years to exit. That's a maximum, right? They typically would want an exit sooner than 9 years, but that's the maximum runway. If a VC makes an investment in year 2, it's got a runway of 8 years. If they make an investment in year 3, it's 7, year 4 is 6. So you can clearly see that in the early part of the fund, VCs are more likely to take sort of more riskier bets than they otherwise would towards the end of the fund. And so that's how the structure sort of informs the decision-making or part of it. VCs also typically reserve capital for follow-on investments in the winners. And once they've invested essentially about 80% of the fund, they start focusing on raising capital, new capital for a new fund. So it's a sort of continuous process that's never ending, assuming you're a successful VC and you continue to remain in existence. Next slide, please.
Nee, I was just going to comment here really quickly. the years 1 through 4, you mentioned that the VCs are investing the bulk of the fund there. They're investing, but they're also doing is they're committing. So they may not actually invest the full amounts in the companies, but they have reserves and commitments that they make to the companies that they may be investing in those future years as well. So it may not necessarily, the capital influx happens totally into the company those first 1 through 4 years, but there may be allotments that are reserved for those later financings as well that happen during that time. So I just wanted to mention that.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So year 1 through 4, as you mentioned, Kirsten, is a commitment period, and there's a lot of investing done there. But there are also follow-on investments that happen in later years.
Yeah. Great. All right. I'll move on to the next part, the diligence process.
Right. So with that intro to VCs out of the way, let's perhaps get into the meat of the discussion today, and we start with the diligence process. The diligence process is the means by which a VC comprehensively assesses the potential of an investment opportunity, and entrepreneurs and investors sort of take a different approach to this, and quite rightly so, because they're sort of opposing counterparties here. The entrepreneurs are essentially trying to convince the investors to say yes, and to say yes as quickly as possible. But on the other hand, the VCs are sort of inundated with lots of investment opportunities. So, as they sort of pass the sea of opportunities available to them, they're sort of trying to get to a no as quickly as possible. And so that's also a key difference in approaches towards the diligence process. Could we have the next slide, please? So here we have on the slide, we sort of show the key areas of diligence to be considered by a VC, and the areas such as the team, the market opportunity, the science, the clinical data, etc. And the sizes of the boxes on the slide here is sort of meant to denote the importance of the elements to the diligence process. And this is perhaps a schematic with a bit of an OUP flavor. So other VCs might perhaps emphasize other things more than we have here. But at OUP, that there is also a distinction between life science and tech. And I'll perhaps invite Mitra to chime in for life science. For a life science perspective, after I've gone through the main components here. So as a VC, you're essentially sort of peering into the future, trying to figure out if a company is going to be successful. And you're using whatever evidence is available to you today to make that judgment of the future. And it's really a very tough thing to do, because the pieces of evidence available to you are imperfect. So, for example, I recently diligenced a 3D printing company, and I had to look at things like, the technology that we're using and how it compares to the competition. There's lots of 3D printing technologies out there, and it's not really clear which one's going to win. I also had to look at things like the market opportunity, and there the picture is also murky. There are lots of companies out there touting the advantages of 3D printing, but industry as a whole hasn't really embraced additive manufacturing. So as a VC, as I take each one of these boxes and diligence this 3D printing opportunity, the information available to me is very sparse and very murky. However, there's one thing that's probably more knowable out of all these boxes, and it's also quite literally sitting in front of you, sort of spewing evidence at you, and that's the team, right? The team is a sort of super tangible entity that's incredibly important to the success of any startup. And so it sort of makes sense that a VC puts a considerable amount of effort into diligencing the team. And even though data on everything else is murky and sparse and imperfect, a VC should at least endeavor to get the question of team correct. So that's sort of what we do at OUP. We attach a great deal of importance to the team, and as such, it takes a significant amount of our deliberations during our diligence process. Mitra, would you perhaps like to provide additional context for life science if it's appropriate here?
Absolutely, Nee, thank you. As you can see across tech and life sciences, team is front and center. It is something on the life sciences side that we also spend a lot of time thinking about and considering in terms of if it's the right team and the right sort of expertise on the team to move this company forward. In addition, we also look very closely, as you can imagine, at the science and clinical data to date that supports the science that you're looking to fund in a certain area. In terms of that third area that we're looking at as well, you can see IP, similar to tech on the life sciences side, is important. Competition similarly, but what stands out in contrast to the tech side is we really look at the regulatory and reimbursement landscape and requirements on the life sciences side, because lots of the opportunities that we're looking at are going through a regulatory process in order to have validation and be able to be used by the final user, which is the patient. So those are considerations that we have to think very deeply about when making a decision in this space. And we'll go more into detail about that process and what exactly we look for in subsequent slides.
Sorry, I was on mute there. Thank you, Mitra. So the idea of team is important to varying degrees on the tech side and the life science side, but the idea of team is really important when we're looking at a startup, and it's perhaps diving deeper into this topic to learn more on what VCs look for. Next slide, please. So in VC, there's sort of the saying that betting on the jockey and not the horse, and quite frankly, it can be viewed as a question as well. Do you bet on the jockey or do you bet on the horse? And in this context, the jockey is essentially the team, and the horse is the idea or the product that the company is building, or it could perhaps refer to the market that the company is sort of playing in. And I think majority of VCs would agree, especially on the tech side, that in most cases, when in doubt, you bet on the jockey and not really the horse. I know things are a little bit more nuanced on the life science side of things. Next slide, please. So as far as betting on the jockey goes, there's no one more fitting of that title than the CEO. The CEO is a sort of tip of the spear, as it were, for the team. And listed here are some key things we look for in a CEO. So in a CEO, we sort of look for someone with vision, a clear vision. It's important for a startup for the CEO to have a really clear vision, because the startup is trying to build something that doesn't exist. So it's important to have someone who sort of had a sort of pointed, elevated view of what the startup's trying to achieve. We also believe a CEO should be realistic and some would say modest. In general, investors are realistic people. And even though you want to see a CEO with a big vision, you want that vision grounded in some reality. Communication is also a big point, and it's extremely important. Even though a CEO holds and develops the vision of the company, where the rubber meets the road, it's the employees of the firm that sort of make the magic happen. So it's incredibly important that a CEO can sort of clearly communicate the vision that they're trying to achieve for the company, clear enough that it condenses into actions and objectives for employees in their day-to-day activities. VCs also like to see a nice balance in ego in a CEO. You want to see a CEO with a high enough ego to imbue themselves with belief and imbue the employees with belief and motivation, but you want it to be low enough that they're thoughtful and have some sort of emotional IQ and perhaps know when it's the right time to step aside if that time ever comes. Adaptability is also a key feature of a CEO, of a good CEO. Startups inevitably have to pivot, and having an adaptable CEO is key to enabling that flexibility. Next slide, please. So apart from the CEO, VCs also look at the rest of the team. So for key members, you're sort of looking at the track record of the individuals within the team. So you're looking at what they've done in the past, what success they've achieved, what skill sets they have, and quite frankly, what skill sets they lack. And VCs also, in respect to the management team, are also looking to see if the management team has the right plan and priorities set for the company. They're also asking if the members of the management team are easy to work with. Are there folks that other people want to leave other companies to work for just because this individual is at this company? So can they attract top talent, and so on and so forth. So in diligencing the team, a VC will typically make reference calls to former associates, acquaintances, and essentially conduct a thorough background check as they can on the management team. Next slide, please. So, VCs consider sort of the wider team beyond just the management team, and that includes, the board of directors and the scientific advisory board, if that's something that your firm has. And so it's important to get these right. So sort of one last point on the management team. It's important that the roles of the members within the management team are pretty clear. So the roles between the CEO, the CTO, and other founding members perhaps are fully clearly outlined. And it's also good, moving on from the management team, to have a pretty strong board of directors, because this conveys a level of confidence to your investors. It's usually a good idea to use your board to plug any gaps in experiences or expertise that you may be lacking within your management team. So, for example, if you're, say, a young company and you're unable to hire an experienced and battle-tested chief product officer, it's probably a good idea to have someone on your board of that caliber, who, although isn't part of the day-to-day operations of your firm, it's available for you to ask key questions of and to provide much needed advice as your firm continues to grow. For highly technical and scientific startups, you may also want to consider a scientific advisory board made up of experts that can help guide your company, especially when it comes to technical decision-making. Next slide, please.
Wait, just one quick thing that I'll add here. So for the scientific advisory board, these are common for therapeutics companies, less so on the tech side. These often are put together early for a company, and the company, similarly to what they would do with the board of directors, might lean heavily on this SAB early on for information on a space and to help make decisions, especially if they don't have individuals on the team yet to help with that information. One thing to be careful of here is overstating the amount of work and amount of time that a scientific advisory board member is spending with you. If you have their face, their name on one of your slides, you need to be ready to state the level of engagement that they have with your company. And that is also a signal to investors as to how excited, some of these high profile individuals are about your technology.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Mitra. Right. So moving on, evaluating the data. Next slide, please. Moving on from aspects of the team, there are also other aspects of diligence VCs look at, and evaluating the science or technology underpinning your company is also a key consideration. As a VC in deep tech, I'm always interested in the core technology and the science behind the product of a startup. But the level of depth of inquiry varies from VC to VC. So during your call, you should be during a call or a due diligence process with a VC, you should expect to speak quite clearly about the nature of your technology and the advantages of your technology, and to provide convincing evidence of the performance of the technology or the science. It should be noted that VCs aren't like really interested in pure raw data. They're more interested in the summary of your results and how it compares to other competing or pre-existing technologies or science. So it's quite tricky to judge the level of depth to prepare for when speaking to a VC. But what I generally recommend is that you do a background check on the VC you're speaking to gauge sort of the anticipated level of technical discussion. And it's pretty easy to do with, for example, like a quick LinkedIn search of a VC. You're looking at things like the education background, the industries they've worked in, the type of companies they've invested in, so on and so forth. That sort of helps you to figure out how deep you should expect to go with a VC. So in general, VCs want to know, what your product does, how it works, any technical validation you might have for the performance of your product. VCs also like to know that you're sort of well-read and well connected within the field that you operate in. They also want to know who your competitors are within the space and how their technology stacks up to yours. And if you have any data on that, and if you can share that, that's actually pretty helpful. They may also ask that you recommend people they could sort of speak to validate your technology. And the quality and caliber of people you recommend is telling of your knowledge and your network within the field. So they're sort of doing all of this with you, but outside of those discussions, they're also doing due diligence on their own without you. So they're doing an exhaustive literature review. They're speaking to scientific experts within their network. They're speaking to industry contacts that could be potential target customers for your product. And in some cases, they could even be speaking to your competitor. So, for example, I'm currently doing a due diligence on a company in the photonic space, and I was able to arrange a meeting to talk to a competitor of the startup I was looking into. I was able to ask tough questions and receive tough responses about the opposing startup's technology. So be prepared for things like that. Next slide, please.
So I'm going to pause right there because we have a question actually that was about boards. And I know that we just passed that subject, but I don't want to get too far past that subject before we move on to our further subjects. So, and I'm actually going to ask this of Mitra just to save your voice a little bit, Nee. Mitra, what are your thoughts on including angel investors on the board of directors?
Thanks, Kirsten. And I've actually been on boards where angels were involved. And, it's really about asking the question of who's able to add value. And early stage companies, oftentimes their investor syndicate is mostly angels and maybe no institutional. So in that scenario, if they're going to add value, then I see no problem with having an angel on board. Oftentimes, angels at the early stage might be a person who has a deep expertise in the area. The one instance that I'm thinking of was a med device company where some of the early investors were actually doctors who would use some of these devices. So they had very clear value add on some of the early decision making and discussions on the board.
Great. Thank you so much for that answer. Nee, I'll go back to you and I'll move on to the next slide, as you mentioned.
Right. So I'll just give a few points regarding market opportunity, commercial plans, and operational and manufacturing considerations. So let's assume you have a great team, great CEO, your product looks great, science and underpinning technology checks out. Another factor where VC will be doing some probing is the market opportunity. Ideally, as a VC, one likes to see a product or an idea with a potential of reaching, for example, $1 billion in revenue. Of course, different VCs look for different things, but in general, it's hard to get a VC excited about an idea that tops out at, say, 100 million. So niche markets are typically a hard sell, and by that I mean niche in terms of the market size and not the application. You could have applications of niche market applications that actually have a sizable market share. So yeah, niche market's pretty tough sell, and it's important as a startup to know how big the market you're operating in is, and to make some assumptions about what share of that market you could ultimately command. Next slide, please. So, I'd initially anticipated going through an example here, but I may be running over time, so I might speed through this. So here I just wanted to quickly show how one can go about sizing up a market. I sort of drafted up a sort of fictitious company called Data Optics, and they provide fiber optic connectors or transceivers in data centers. And on the next slide, and this is sort of how such a company might sort of build up an expectation of the market, assuming that there isn't any industrial reports available that can provide that clarity. So, won't really get too much into the details, but, for a data center, you're probably starting with a number of data centers and the average number of servers there. And then you're doing some assumptions on the number of ports per servers to figure out how many connectors are in that world. And then you're sort of applying an annual replacement rate to figure out how many of these connectors are being sold annually, and that sort of gets you to total sales. And then you make an example, you make an assumption of what portion of that market you could potentially go after, and sort of make a plan of how you go after that market, how much revenue you would expect to generate and when. So that's sort of a quick example of how one might go about that. But on the next slide, we'll talk about sort of reviewing the commercial plan. So assuming you have a sort of a wonderful, huge, tantalizing opportunity, a VC would like to review the commercial plan you have in place to capture that market opportunity. So as a VC, you're sort of trying to figure out what the business model is of the company and how they plan to generate revenues and how they plan to grow those revenues. So a VC might be asking questions about your customer base, so what kind of customers you're trying to reach. They might be asking about your distribution and how you plan to reach those customers. They might be asking about your pricing, i.e., what value proposition does your product offer and how much are customers willing to pay for that value. So as a VC, you're looking to assess whether the plan, the market, the product, the customer need all sort of fit together into one cohesive thesis. And it has to be said that depending on the state of your startup or the phase your startup's in, you may not have all of these things figured out. And even though you don't, it's always a good idea to sort of at least show an outline of your thinking as you speak to VCs. So for example, I'm currently diligencing a company, it's got a great team, it's got great technology that's solving a really critical problem in an absolutely huge market, but they have no product yet. So, that sort of puts me on the fence there. And because I just don't know what product they're going to build and I don't know how they're going to commercialize it. So we may still invest in this product, it's not sort of a deal killer. But I'm perhaps somewhat ill at ease because this company hasn't nailed down a product or a product market fit or a commercialization plan. Next slide, please. So regarding operations and manufacturing considerations, if we think of manufacturing specifically, that doesn't really apply to every startup. However, manufacturing can be quite critical depending on the industry you're in. So I see lots of startups in the semiconductor space, the battery and EV technology space, in the new material space or clean tech. These are all sort of heavy manufacturing-based companies. And having a good manufacturing plan sometimes can be the make or break of the startup. So if your company sort of leans that way, be prepared to go into those sorts of details with your VC. In terms of operations, of course, this applies more broadly to startups. So a VC might be looking to probe into the inner workings of your startup, how it runs, how you generate sales, who's generating those sales, your process or pipeline for those sales. So it's always good to be fully thought out and ready for those questions. So I think that's perhaps the end of the slides that I'm presenting. I'll hand over to Mitra to bring us home on this one.
Excellent. Thanks, Mi. So if you can go to the next slide, please, Kirsten. Great. So as part of any diligence, one of the initial questions will always be, what is proprietary here? So there are generally two levels of IP due diligence. Those that occur early and are often handled by investors themselves, and then a second, deeper evaluation of the IP that occurs later. And this is typically handled by an IP professional, and typically after being hired by the lead investor. If not on the first call, then in a follow-up correspondence, expect questions around intellectual property, including what type of patents have been filed and the status, and whether they're provisional, and if there's a fully executed license or an option there. And if there's a license, whether it's exclusive. You'll also want to have this information in the data in the data room. And so having that available for an investor to dig into by themselves, or when they're ready to bring in an IP attorney. So the deeper analysis by an IP professional includes analyzing the patents and language, ensuring that what the company claims aligns with the patent language, and also that there's truly freedom to operate here. And again, this is something that's done later in the diligence process. And the lead investor will oftentimes be the one who leads the engagement of this IP attorney or IP professional, and will oftentimes open up those discussions to other investors that might be joining the syndicate, so that they can follow along with this process. Next slide, please. So regulatory considerations. So it's really important for the company to be able to share with an investor the relevant regulatory bodies that they'll be engaging with through the process of developing their technology. And oftentimes investors will already be familiar with these regulatory bodies, but it's important for the company to demonstrate that they're also very aware of the views of these bodies and how it'll impact their developmental plan, or the development plan. So for example, for therapeutics in the US, you're looking at speaking with the FDA to go through this process. In the EU, there's a different regulatory body, that's the EMA. So they'll have different requirements for the approval of a therapeutic. If you're working in biologics or small molecules for crop protection, this will be someone like the EPA in the US. So just having a clear understanding of who you're going to be needing to engage with, and the types of questions that they'll be asking, and when in the timeline of development that you'll need to be engaging these regulatory agencies. So another consideration is any financial or provider regulations. So perhaps there's a requirement for payers or healthcare companies for there to be a certain medication used in a space prior to anything else being used. So you have to understand if there are step-through requirements in a treatment paradigm, and and that'll come into play if you're thinking about one, what the market size might be, but also that payers really do have a perspective here that's important to understand when doing a diligence. There might also be, regulations in play that say that only a certain type of physician is allowed to prescribe a medication or a device, and that's something that's very important to also understand. In terms of, are there any what's the regulatory path required for approval? One of the, easiest examples here to go to is in medical devices. So is there going to be a 510(k) path, or is it a PMA? So these are two very different paths with two very different needs and timelines. So the 510(k) clearance is authorization from the FDA to market a medium risk medical device. This includes things like pregnancy testing kits, intravenous kits, sutures, powered wheelchairs, runs the gamut. While PMA is required for more high-risk products, and these are things like implanted medical devices, or those that sustain life. So, on one end, the 510(k) just requires that you are substantially equivalent to predicate device, whereas the PMA is more in-depth, and it's used to prove that a new device is both safe and effective, and requires a whole clinical trial process. So those sorts of understandings are very important very early on in a diligence to understand, and an investor will rely heavily, at least initially, on a company to share that in a pitch as they're forming their opinion of whether or not to spend time on an opportunity. Lastly, there are several policy changes that might impact market dynamics and influence a startup strategy. And one that comes to mind, that's on the minds of many these days in the therapeutic space, is the IRA. And, the IRA is changing the calculus in a meaningful way in terms of how pharma companies and VCs are thinking about the development of biologics versus small molecules. More specifically, this legislation spares biologics from price controls for 13 years versus 9 years for small molecule drugs. So it's really, starting to impact the way investors think about, which types of modalities to look closely at. And also, for pharma companies, when they're thinking about building their portfolio of assets, which types to bring in. Next slide, please. One more, please. So now we're going into the competitive landscape, which is a very important component of your pitch and what you should be sharing with your the investors that you're speaking with. Investors will know a little bit about this coming in, and so it's really important that you show that you understand who's in the competitive landscape that you're going to be operating in as well. So you're going to want to describe the current state of care for the addressable patients, but that isn't the end of the story here. You're also going to want to share what's in development and who you view as key competitors that might come online and into the market while you're developing your product. So think about things that are in clinical development at this point, because the standard of care might be shifting over time, and you need to be able to anticipate that because investors will be doing that as well. So you should conduct a thorough search on current treatments that are in development, especially those in late stage development. And this includes not only drugs that are being developed for your indication or therapeutic area of interest, but also drugs that have the same mechanism of action, but might be being used in another indication. Also, if the current treatments in development may change the current standard of care and raise the bar, you really need to be able to anticipate this and speak to what that new bar might be. Importantly, you must also be able to outline the technical differences compared to these other closely related technologies. So you want to be able to compare across these technologies across a number of dimensions and show in what ways that you will stand out, not only in positive ways, but be ready to answer why you might compare poorly in a dimension to a competitor. And if you don't cover that in a slide, you want to be ready to answer these questions, because we all know that that no product is perfect, but we need to understand what the pain points might potentially be, and also how to mitigate some of these potential challenges. Next slide, please. So just to double click on my last statement about making sure to emphasize and make clear how your approach is differentiated, it's often helpful to do so by either having a grid listing the top competitors with check marks maybe across different areas like cost or COGS or ease of use, whatever dimensions that you think are important in your industry. Another visualization that you can see here on the right-hand side of the slide is a 2x2 that helps resolve the competitive landscape across two different axes. And that's helpful to just show how you might cluster with certain competitors in the space, or how you might be truly differentiated along two axes. But again, be ready to answer questions about why you use those axes and which other ones where you would fall if different ones were used. Next slide, please. So valuation and exit analysis. This is part of the process. Typically, in a pitch deck, companies will have a list of comparable deals in the space just to, I think, anchor an investor to what the potential might be for them in success. However, we also do this work, and we put together a list of comparables that will help us understand what we might see in success as well. So this will include M&A transactions or IPOs and what the value of that company is on the public market. And so here you can see an example of such comps. Next slide, please.
I'll just mention really quickly here, Mitra, that we did go over valuations in the previous webinar in this particular series, and we're going to go over some more on exit analyses too in the next webinar too. So that's one of the reasons we're not covering that so much in this particular webinar.
Thank you. And I forgot to mention that. And so please do refer to our other resources on valuation. Great. So we're going to round out with the investment memo. So really, this is the summary of all of the work that the investor or the investors are doing over time. And this is a live, so living document that is evolving over time as more information is gathered. But it'll then be used to memorialize this information. So at a certain point, it's sort of set in stone and a decision is made. But what is included in this investment memo? Again, it's a summary of a lot of the different topics that we already went over, but in totality, what it's saying is why we should invest. It's recommending an investment, but why? And also not only the positives of the investment, but what if we look back in a few years, what the challenges might have been to success. So as I mentioned, this is a living document. It evolves over time, but who's looking at this is it's constantly being viewed by investment team members as it's being socialized and up into the point of the investment decision itself. Next slide, please. So this is just double clicking on those key items that are going to be addressed in the investment memo. So we'll have the thesis that summarizes everything. It's the recommendation or not. It's then going to double click into every component of the company that we've been looking closely at, including the management team, who they are, have they been successful in the past? If we're thinking about the CEO, can they build a good team? Are they able to hire talent? Are they able to fundraise? As I mentioned before, we're not only explaining why we want to invest, but also laying out what the key risks are here in case, that we may have looked into, but we cannot get fully comfortable with, and it'll just be a risk that we understand, but are all right with. Competition, as I just mentioned, you want to understand what the competitive landscape is and how you're differentiated, and we'll be, detailing that in the investment memo. The development time and milestones, the company usually presents this as a Gantt, and oftentimes we'll just pull that directly from company materials and comment on, the plan in place and what we feel like is appropriate costs or, flags to look for that might not be overcome or might be too aggressive in terms of timeline or budget. Term sheet summary. So I believe we've gone over term sheets in a past webinar, but really just identifying key language in there that'll impact, the dynamics of who the board is and what the capital requirements and our own amount invested for the company. The cap table, which is a summary of the folks that are invested and also, what has been put into the company prior and what those shares are worth at this given stage. An exit analysis, and this is sort of the tag along to the comparables, as once we've looked at, what we could potentially make in success, how much money we would think to put in at each stage and anticipating those capital requirements needed over time and making a decision of, after all of that, is this still a good investment decision for us at this time, at this stage of the company? and key takeaways from expert calls. So over time, to supplement the information that we're getting from the data room, from the company, from the scientific advisory board, from current investors, we're also going to be engaging with key opinion leaders from the field that might include anything from, if it's a therapeutic opportunity, talking to physicians who might use this, talking to payers, so insurance companies, and what they'll actually reimburse for a typical drug, and also maybe key scientific leaders, thought leaders in this space, whether on the scientific side or the industry side. So all of those will come together to help, influence our view on an investment decision. Next slide, please. So to crossing the finish line. So this is variable from firm to firm. So you prepare this investment memo. It's a living document. You collect all the information over time, and it changes over the time as you socialize it with the investment committee and people on the investment team to make sure that you've encompassed all of the key questions that the investment team may have. So what happens after you've done all that? Where the final step involves presenting this to the investment committee. And the investment committee is comprised most often of the managing partners of the firm. There may also be other members that are pulled in, and it could vary from firm to firm, but most often it's the managing partners who form this investment committee. So at this point, the investment committee will, in a group together, view this opportunity, discuss it, and make the final decision. And this may vary firm to firm. Some firms have multiple investment committee discussions and opportunities to make a decision. Others have just one meeting. And, so that will be something that's variable. And so expect that, diversity from firm to firm. And as I mentioned here, is for some firms, it's a rubber stamp, and maybe this decision has already been made because the socialization process has been very thorough and folks have already signed off before this discussion is even allowed to take place at the level of the investment committee. So again, it depends firm to firm. So when you hear that you're at the point within an investment firm that they're going to committee, it might mean something or signal something differently depending on the firm. So lastly, after the lead of a round has submitted and signed a term sheet and the syndicate has joined, the last part is, get final signatures and have the money wired. So at that point, at the point that the money hits the bank is the end of the process. But, this is a very high level overview of those last steps that occur between the diligence, the sign off on the committee, and the wiring of the money. So I will pause there because I think that's the last slide and see if there are any questions from the prior slides.
There are questions actually from earlier thoughts that we had and I am just going to mention before we go into those questions that our next session in this series will be on ownership, cap tables, waterfalls, and exits, and we'll be announcing the date of that in the near future. But one question that came in, and I'm going to stop sharing soon, before actually, Mitra, was how early do you expect a startup to form a board?
Immediately. They're the decision-making body. So the board evolves over time. Absolutely. So, the question earlier, it's a good segue to the earlier question of, should there be angels on the board, right? The people who could add the most value given your access to them should be the ones involved with the board at the time. So early on, you should have a board that's who helps you make the decisions and keep on timeline. Oftentimes at the earliest stages, it's a small group of people. It's maybe the one person who gave you some money and the CEO, and maybe something that we call an independent board member. So it's somebody who has expertise in the space that you pull in to help you make those decisions at the highest level for the company. And again, as new money comes in, that board will evolve and change over the time based on the needs of the company and the people who have given capital.
Great, thank you. Nee, there was a question earlier that I know you typed a response to, but I'd like both of you to answer it live, actually. And that's about teams that are kind of early stage as far as their careers in entrepreneurship as well. So, and it was, how do you look upon teams that are basically trainees, such as grad students and postdocs, plus a recent MBA, for instance? And Mitra, I'll ask this first of you and also of me, but I know that we've done some analyses, and actually that some of these, early stage teams, perhaps who don't have as much experience, actually sometimes perform extremely well with the companies. So, Nee, do you want to try go?
Right. Yeah. I was actually trying to find my response to that question, but I might have misinterpreted it. But I thought if the question is if you have sort of a trainee as a member of your team, so say you're a fully staffed team, fully experienced, and you have, your team is, for lack of a better word, padded with trainees who perhaps don't have any experience. My view would be that you probably don't get any credit for those particular team members. But if the question is, you're a graduate student, perhaps without much industrial experience, but you have been working on the technology that you're trying to commercialize. If the question is whether those teams, how those teams are looked upon by VC, I think it varies, and pretty much along the lines of what you said. You could have a grad student that's founded a company, never done anything of the sort before, but sort of has the intangibles, as it were, of a good leader, a good CEO, and so once you can see those qualities in those individuals, I think you're happy to sort of forgive their lack of experience. But it's a tougher bar to definitely get over without experience. Sure.
Mitra, you want to answer that one too?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question, and it comes up quite a bit. And the answer, is it depends. It depends on the VC. The VCs have very different views, and oftentimes very strong views, right, about the team component and the team question here. Some VCs are very happy and actually look to the founding scientist or the founding entrepreneur to stay with the company at a leadership position, and for them signals that there is true passion and belief in the technology if the founder stays along. Other VCs might run on the other end of the spectrum and absolutely want to have full control over who is on the leadership team, and they might build that leadership team themselves, and they might require that they have industry experience and a depth of experience that maybe the founding entrepreneur does not have. And that's a conversation that needs to happen between the entrepreneur and the VC early on, so that there is an understanding of what the expectation is on both sides.
Great. And our last question, rounding out our hour, we'll finish up here, is, and this is a great question to actually for us to end with, which is about the feedback typically provided to the startup companies when we're talking with them or with other VCs, et cetera, allowing them to improve, perhaps. If you are pitched by someone, giving them that feedback. What kind of feedback is typically given? Is it typically kept private? And obviously, I know much of this is going to be nuanced and depend on the situation as well. But could you speak a little bit about the feedback that VCs can give to help startups understand, perhaps why an investment doesn't occur, and then what they can do to make that investment perhaps more likely in the future? And Mitra, I'll start off with you on that one.
It's a complex question because there's many reasons why VCs pass. Some of them they can share, some of them they can't. Some of them boil down to something, we started off with talking about how VCs work and the timeline, the 10-year investing period. Sometimes it boils down to you're too early based on where we are in the fund, right? Or it's portfolio construction, and maybe we have invested, over indexed on early oncology. So we have to diversify a little bit more, right? So sometimes, it's an answer that's non-satisfying. Other times it's a little bit more clearer and something that you can, you yourself work on as a company, like we would like to see non-human primate data before we can look at it again. But, it really varies firm to firm how much they will share. And sometimes firms don't even formally pass, they'll just not respond anymore. So it's, there'll be that end of the spectrum all the way to giving you a couple of sentences or in real time, a pass and reasons why.
Nee.
Right. So yeah, it's sort of similar answer from me as well. Definitely depends from firm to firm. I think the general, the general expectations out there is that and perhaps I'll start by saying it depends on how deep in the diligence process you are as well. So, if it was just the first call, the first intro, and the VC didn't like the firm, it's highly unlikely they would provide detailed feedback, because VCs are looking at dozens of firms a month, and it just adds to the workload of them having to provide useful and detailed feedback as well. So it might be sort of a simple no, or as often is the case, they might even not get back to you at all. But if you're sort of deeper in the due diligence process, I think the deeper you go, the more helpful the feedback is when they say no, right? Because they've actually taken the time to look at your company, and perhaps might also, as is sometimes the case here at OUP, might just be saying no for now, right? So we might be willing to invest in you later, but it's no for now. And here's a detailed feedback as to why it's a no. And we hope to have another conversation during your next round to see if it's something that we would reconsider.
Great, thank you both. I think that in general, if you don't get the feedback right away, it doesn't hurt to ask, and ask it in a very kind way, but that with the intention that you want to be able to use that feedback to improve for the future. And I think that was the way the questioner put it, was actually was quite good. So, but I think those are both terrific answers. Definitely depends a lot on various factors. But yes, okay, so we have finished our questions. Thank you both so much for being our panelists today, Mitra and Nee, and thank you to our audience for joining us and staying with us just past the hour. If you do have any follow-up questions for us, we will be sending out the slides and the recording to all the registrants, and that will include the contact information for all of us there. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Nee and Mitra, for preparing all this terrific material that everyone could learn by. Everyone enjoy your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.